Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock, and 9 o'clock is with me, Father Warner. We are in Saturday, the 30th week in Ordinary Time, and we are beginning a new book today, St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. We're going to begin somewhere in verse 18 of chapter 1. So it's 1 Philippians chapter 18b up to verse 26, and I'm going to read that for you. I've entitled today's teaching, An Introduction to St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, the Epistle of Joy. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted now as always in my body, whether life or by death. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, and I do not know which I prefer. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I am convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, as I said, we are starting a new letter of St. Paul. This is just 4 chapters. Galatians was 6 chapters, Ephesians was 6 chapters, and Philippians is just 4 chapters. I recommend very strongly that you just read through the letter of St. Paul to the Philippians. I can assure you it won't even take you 10 minutes if you do a bit of rapid reading. But let's understand the book so that you can read it comfortably. So the city of Philippi had been founded by Philip. Philip was the father of Alexander the Great. This is a strategic site for the Romans, as I will say later again, in a very military sense. If you looked at Philippi, there were a range of hills even now that divides Europe from Asia, and at Philippi the range of hills dips into a pass. Philippi also was a Roman colony, and for the Romans this place had a great military significance. Now, one of the greatest battles of history between Mark Antony and Brutus and Cassius took place here in Philippi. Now, it was on his second missionary journey in about the year 52 AD that Paul came to Philippi. Paul had sailed, we know, from Alexandrian Troas in Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and then he had landed in Neapolis in Europe, and from there he made his way to the city of Philippi. The story of Paul's sojourn in Philippi, if you want to read it, you will find it in Acts chapter 16. Now, Paul had to leave Philippi after a storm of persecution took place, and also after Paul was illegally imprisoned in Philippi. Now, that persecution that Paul endured was also inherited by the church in Philippi. So Paul will tell them that the people of Philippi, he'll say, you have shared in my bonds and in my defense of the gospel. And you'll see this in the text prior to this, is not one that I've read, but in chapter 1, verse 7, he will speak of this, his imprisonment and in the sharing of his trials with the people of Philippi. Now, what he has gone through, they too, he says, are going to go through. And so he wants to strengthen them. He will tell them in verses 28 not to be afraid. You'll see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 28 to 30. He will encourage them not to be afraid. There had also been a growing friendship between Paul and the church of Philippi. This friendship was closer than any other church that Paul ever had. He was extremely fond of them. It was his proud boast that he had not taken any money from any church, that he had always earned his keep as a tent maker. But from the church in Philippi, he had accepted a gift. Now, why is Paul writing this letter to the Philippians? You see, when Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison in Rome, and he wrote it with a purpose. It is meant also to be a letter of thanks. In fact, if you read chapter 1 verse 3 onwards, he will say, I thank my God for you each time I think of you, and when I pray for you, I pray with joy because you have shared, words that we just done, you have shared in my imprisonment, in my suffering. Now, it is around 63 or 64 AD. And once again, the Philippians have sent him a gift. How do we know this? If you turn to your Bible and look at chapter 4, verse 10 to 11, it mentions this, that they have sent him a gift. It also has to do with another man, a man called Epaphroditus. Now, it seems that the Philippians had sent him not only as the bearer of this gift, but they had also sent Epaphroditus so that he would stay as a personal helper of Paul. But Epaphroditus had fallen sick, and he had fallen sick because he was homesick. And Paul was concerned that when he sent Epaphroditus back to the Philippians, they might think of Epaphroditus as a quitter, as one who just quit on Paul, quit on his mission. So Paul is going to go out of his way to give him a testimonial, okay? And you will see that testimonial in verse 29 of chapter 2, where he will say, welcome him then in the Lord with all joy and honor such people, because he came close to death for the work of Christ. So it is a letter also of encouragement to the Philippians, because they are going through their trials, to strengthen them. Finally, St. Paul wrote this letter as a letter of unity, and you will see that very strongly in tomorrow's text. It is from this that rises the great passage that speaks of the selfless humility of Jesus Christ. Tomorrow's text will be from chapter 2 verse 1 to 4, but the entire hymn, the most ancient hymn in praise of Christ's humility, is seen in chapter 2 verse 1 to 11. Now, also in the church at Philippi, there were two women who quarreled and who were endangering the peace. How do we know that? Look at chapter 4 verse 2. He mentions Syntyche and Euodia. Now, these two women were fighting, and he also mentions them, and he says, I urge them to be of the same mind in the Lord. But there was another reason why he was writing. So you can see there were several reasons. There were false teachers who were seeking to lure the Philippians from the true path, and that we can see in chapter 3 verse 2. Beware, he says, and this is a very strong word he uses. He says, beware of the dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. Obviously, there were people going around disturbing and telling them, well, if you are followers of Jesus Christ, have you been circumcised? That's why he says, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. They are not there to circumcise you, they are there to mutilate you. So the letter by and large is an appeal to maintain unity. Now, Philippians is in fact the loveliest letter ever written. It has been called by two titles. It's been called the Epistle of Excellent Things, and it's also called the Epistle of Joy. Again and again, Paul will use the word rejoice. Even in prison, he directs the hearts of his listeners to rejoice. In fact, usually in one of the cycles of the Advent second readings, you will hear these words from St. Paul: rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say to you, rejoice. Now, the letter of St. Paul to the Philippians is written, as I said, from prison. Such letters are also referred to as the captivity epistles. Since Paul was in prison awaiting trial, he had to face the fact that it was quite uncertain whether he would live or die, and to him it made actually no difference. Ironically, it is easier to die for the Lord than to live for him. Living for God is a great challenge because you have to face your demons each day. For Paul, Christ was the reason why he lived. There was never a moment when Paul did not experience Christ in his life. Christ for Paul was the beginning of the life on the road to Damascus. Yet, death for Paul was an entrance into Christ's presence. This obviously showed that Paul did not fear death. Though some men may fear dying, no Christian should fear death. So the result was that Paul was literally swayed between two desires. In fact, in verse 23 of chapter 1, he says these words. He says, I am hard pressed between the two, his desire to live for the Lord and his desire to die so that he may enter into God's presence. Now, the word he uses to describe his predicament, hard pressed, is senekomai. Senekomai, that's the Greek word. The word, it's the same word which is used for a traveler in a narrow defile with a wall of rock on both sides. The traveler is unable to turn to the left or the right. He is only able to go straight on. Senekomai. He is literally hard pressed. So while Paul desired to depart and be with Christ, he says, for that is better. He will say that in verse 23, it is better. He also felt that great tug at his heart to stay back on account of his friends and for the ministry that lay ahead. He genuinely does not know which to choose. He's not just fooling around. He genuinely doesn't know. He does not know which would be the better thing for himself, for the work of the gospel and for the glory of God. He really genuinely doesn't know. Now, departing from this world as expressed by Paul, because he says, I do not know whether to stay or to depart. Departing for Paul was very conscious that this departing is not just a one-day trip after which he can return. You see, he uses this word very consciously. He says, I desire to depart. And the word, once again in Greek, analuein, indicated this word analuein, which is the word used for departing. Analuein indicated a whole process of movement. It once again linked to a military camp. So it was a process of movement by which a military camp was literally stripped, its tents were loosened, its pins were removed. Paul wants to indicate, therefore, and this is a beautiful thought, he wants to indicate that our departing is literally a moving on. You see, death is not the end, death is a moving on. Now, having discerned and being convinced of this, Paul finally makes a choice for the good of all. And that choice, he says, I will remain with you. He will stay with them. At that point of time, his presence, he says, was necessary. It is necessary for me to stay, to remain in his words, he says, it is necessary to remain and continue with you all for their progress and for the joy of their faith. Now, let us be clear. We are dealing here with freedom and choice and not some kind of passive fatalism. This is not what Paul is doing. Paul is not saying that he does not care what happens to him. On the contrary, he passionately wants what his Lord wants, and he positively accepts what his Lord will ask of him. His desire is that his will and God's will coincide perfectly, and this is what we should pray. Not only, Lord, may your will be done, but Lord, I have my dreams, and may those two, if it brings you great joy and pleases you, may those two coincide perfectly. Now, the words that Paul uses in verse 25, that I may remain and continue with. The words remain and continue is a word play in Greek, and you see that Paul does this very cleverly. You can't see it in English. It cannot be reproduced in English, these words. But remain in Greek is menein, and continue in Greek is paramanein. So that's how he uses. Some suggest that this could be seen as the words bide and abide. But when you look at the word para, it really means, from where you get the word paragraph, para really means besides, that is to wait besides a person. So Paul says, I want to wait besides you, ever ready to help you. It's not that I'm just staying here because I want a holiday. Yeah, that's not why I'm staying. I'm staying so that I may remain with you, besides you, ever ready to help you. So then Paul desires, his desire to live is not for his own sake, but for the sake of the people whom he can continue to help. Now, we should note that even in prison, Paul is modeling joy in the faith. And he's modeling joy in the faith for the Philippian Christians so that they may see him and feel encouraged. You know, most people sitting in a prison cell month after month would find themselves at loose ends and quite possibly suffering depression at the circumstances that they find themselves in. Paul, however, views his prison as just one more mission field. Being imprisoned has not blocked his opportunity to proclaim Christ, which is his reason for living. Yeah, the reason why he wants to stay on is to proclaim Jesus Christ. He's happy to have the opportunity, as we know from chapter 1, verse 12 to 13 of today's text, not of today's text, but of 1 Philippians. We know that he's happy to have the opportunity to speak even to the guards and the prisoners about Christ. And his witness has emboldened other Christians to proclaim Christ in circumstances where they otherwise might not have done so. So we are going to study, I think, over the next 6 weekdays. I know in between we're going to have the solemnity of All Saints Day and then All Souls Day. But we're going to spend about 4 teachings that will cover 4 chapters of St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. Today I want to wish a few people a very happy birthday. My dear friend Shelton from Parel, Giselle, also last week we celebrated Giselle's husband and my godchild Sarah's birthday. Today is her birthday. Giselle is a beautiful voice that very often, if you ever come to the parishes I've been, whenever there's a missions, I know Father Michael Piapali is coming next year, and Giselle will always be the person, my go-to person, because she has the most angelic and most beautiful voice. It's also the wedding anniversary of friends of mine, Nima and Eustace. Happy anniversary to you. And to my dearest Shailesh and Anu, this is their 5th wedding anniversary. Many years ago, this was the wedding that launched the debt-free weddings at St. Jude Church. They opted to get married. They had nothing. As Shailesh said, the only thing he had to come in were his shoes. Everything else was provided. And we had the first debt-free wedding. It was the feast day of St. Jude, one day after, but we were celebrating it on that day. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was Bishop Barthol who was the main celebrant. And that evening, the parish had the parish celebrations in a beautiful hall in Children's Academy. And the parish council decided that Shailesh and Anu will celebrate their wedding reception as part of the celebrations of the parish. And I know it hit several newspapers the next day. I will make available on this day, perhaps to those of you who want. You can just send me a message and I'll try to send you the article that I wrote on that occasion. God bless you, everybody. Have a good day, and I will see you. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends. Leave your thoughts, yeah? I want you to react to the books as I'm teaching you. Maybe you face some difficulties, talk about it. So leave your comments in the comment section. Bye, everybody. I'm going to see you again at 9 o'clock tomorrow.